So don't get too caught up in that there's just one way of doing things, that there's an exact amount of degrees that you have to follow.
toget.
What's up guys, it's Johnny Candido of Candido Training HQ. Today I'm going to talk about a question that I've been getting quite often recently, and that is whether you should point your feet forwards or slightly outward when squatting. And if you should point it outwards, how far should you point it outward? What degree, what angle should you have it set? And I've seen other people give their opinion on this topic, but what it seems like to me is that they often ignore important details. For example, the first part I want to talk about is that it depends on your stance width. Reasoning behind pointing your feet more forward rather than pointing them out is so that you can keep pressure on the outside of your foot and prevent your ankle from collapsing in. However, this is unlikely to be an issue in a narrow stance squat because it's very easy to do both, to point your feet slightly outwards and to still keep the external rotation needed to keep the pressure on the outside of your foot. So this is why, in my opinion, the closer the stance, the more you can point your feet outwards, but the wider your stance gets, the more you need to focus on pointing your feet straight forward. That's because in a wide stance squat, you're already forced to use your abductors and you have to maintain external rotation. Now, the problem is if you point your feet outward, it often is too difficult to keep the pressure on the outside of your foot if you have a wide stance squat as well, because then you just get into a weak position, and that's why your knees cave in, because you want to use your quads. And this is why you can see in my hybrid squat tutorial video, my feet are pointed more forward. And I want to make this clear that it's not even necessarily just mobility for why you should do this, because oftentimes you have the mobility to be able to squat with your feet out and with a wider stance, but once the weight gets heavy enough, then your knees cave in. Because remember, it's not just about being flexible enough to be in a position, but it's about actually being strong in that position. I also want to say that if you try to have a narrow stance squat and then keep your feet forward and then shove your knees out as hard as you can, what will happen is this will create more torque at the hip, but it will also stress your knees and hips because now you're not properly aligned and you're putting too much pressure on the outside of your foot. The key is to have a relatively even force distribution across your foot. So you don't want this exaggerated either way. You don't want your knees caving in, and you also don't want to exaggerate putting pressure only on the outside of your foot. I want to reiterate that these are general principles I'm discussing, and for this video this is just keeping in proper alignment. But this doesn't mean any exact amount of degrees is the right way of doing it. I see people ask me this, like with my video on keeping your hips higher in the deadlift. I wasn't saying an exact amount that you should keep your hips high or that you should even keep your hips high. I'm just saying that if your hips rise, then to just set your hips higher. And for this video, if your knees are caving in, then you want to point your feet more inward or bring your stance in. And if you also are simply more comfortable with your feet out and your knees don't cave in, then chances are you're stronger in that position and you have the hip mobility to do that. So there's no reason to avoid that. And even with these general principles, there still always are exceptions. For example, some Chinese weightlifters intentionally allow their knees to come in to generate power out of the bottom of the squat. And I don't recommend this for you, but the point is that there are different ways of doing things, and some people are more comfortable doing unconventional methods. Another example is oftentimes Olympic lifters are comfortable just pointing their feet straight forward and having a narrow stance squat and then not even shoving their knees out. Just having a very forward, almost like a leg press style squat. And that's fine for Olympic lifting. That can actually work for you if you have the ankle mobility to do that. However, for powerlifting, I wouldn't recommend it because now your knees are drifting so far forward, it'd be difficult to hit parallel. But the point is that that is an option, that is a way you can actually do it and you can be successful. So don't get too caught up in that there's just one way of doing things, that there's an exact amount of degrees that you have to follow. That's just simply not true. When it comes down to the specifics, everybody has varying degrees of mobility, of limb length proportions, and of strengths and weaknesses. So you really can't just decide anything based on one exact rule. Alright, that's it guys. I hope this was helpful. Make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks for watching guys. Peace!
You know, I like to call them crumb snatchers. It's the universal name.